Hello everyone, welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today I'm talking about some easy ways to make stats for NPCs. We know they won't often need to have full-on combat stats like the player characters, but they might be required to make checks occasionally, so where do you draw the line? Well, today I'm going to be talking about exactly that, so let's learn something. The first thing I'm going to talk about here are just the random run-of-the-mill NPCs. I mean the ones that your players might run into occasionally, like innkeepers, merchants, and even some recurring characters. Most NPCs like these specifically probably won't need stats. Save your energy for things that are more important to flesh out. But I know what you might be thinking. What if my player tries to grapple them, or lie to them, or something like that requires a check? Well, here you have two options. For one, you can just set a DC that your player has to beat with their check. If you don't know, DC, or difficulty class, is just the number that your player has to beat by rolling equal to or higher than that in order to do whatever they're trying to do. For example, say they wanted to bust down a heavy door. You may require them to make a DC 15 athletics check, and if you're having trouble assigning DCs, there's a whole table on page 238 in the DM's guide with guidelines on different DC levels. But for the watered down version, your player has a higher chance of beating a lower DC than a higher one simply because there are more numbers that lie above the DC that they have to beat. And the higher your player's modifier, the more likely they should be to beat it, so don't go scaling your DCs for your players. That's just wrong. But you can do the same thing through NPCs. For example, if you think the NPC will be good at whatever the opposed check is, make it higher, perhaps 17 to 20 or higher. If not, make it a little lower. So if you have a player trying to lie to an NPC who you think could probably be pretty naive, you can set the DC to 8, maybe, because they probably would have low insight. And if you don't know, insight is the opposed check to deception, which is the check your player would be trying to make to lie to them. And then you can resolve it that way. This method is probably better if you want to predict the outcome of the opposed check, but if you're anything like me and you want a little bit of randomness, I think about a modifier that the NPC would probably have to make the check instead of a DC and then actually roll. This produces more variable results because you're rolling as well now too. Essentially, no matter how high you make the modifier, you can still roll a 1 and you can still roll a 20 even if you make the modifier really low. The same thing goes for a player and their modifiers. So for the above example, I might give a naive NPC a modifier of +0 or even -1 or 2 against the player's roll. And if you have a hard time figuring out what your NPC would be good at, ask yourself what they do for a living and how they live. If they're a merchant, they'd probably have high charisma. If they're a scholar or a researcher, they'd probably have high intelligence. What about low stats? If they're a peasant living in squalor, they might have pretty low constitution. Alternatively, page 89 in the DM's guide, note I've been using the 5e DM's guide so far, has a table all about NPC abilities. Now, this table assumes the same thing I'm assuming, and that's this NPC doesn't need full-on abilities for every single thing, so it lets you roll a d6 to generate a low stat and a high stat. And okay, that's cool and all, but how does that help here? Well, these tables also give you sample descriptions of what these NPCs might look like or act like with low charisma or high strength, for example. But you can also use them in reverse. For example, the DM's guide says that an NPC with high dexterity might be agile or graceful. If you have an NPC that you see as agile or graceful, well, give them a high modifier if they have to make an X check. Quick note, whatever you choose the modifier or DC to be, try to write it down, but if you forget it, it's not the end of the world. I hate to be this way, but your players won't even know it, so you can just come up with another one later on if you need to. But this whole time, I've been talking about opposed checks with your players. What if the NPC just needs to make a check, either because the player asked a member of some guild to put in a good word with their boss, or because they asked a scholar to do research? In these cases, just do the second option that I gave earlier. Assign them a modifier that you think that would suit them, and then roll. For an example, for the scholar doing research, I might assume that their intelligence is high, maybe +3 or 4, and I assume they'd be proficient in the investigation skill. For the average researcher, let's give them a proficiency bonus of +3, adding up to, say, a +7 modifier. So when they roll, add 7 to it. That might sound like a lot, but once you do it a few times, it becomes like second nature. And lastly, what about playing the NPC? I know as a player, your stats play a role in how you play your character, but for roleplay, you don't need all of them. You just need a good idea of who they are. It helps to know what they would be good at, so think, are they smart? Are they charming? Are they strong? And in a way, this translates directly into stats, just like the table I mentioned earlier. I don't typically think about it that way. I just think about them as characteristics for the NPC has, but you could think of a smart NPC as having high intelligence, a strong NPC as having high strength, and a charming NPC as having high charisma. Also give them a little bit of backstory, some appearance, a general idea of how they behave, and usually a personality trait, ideal, bond, and flaw, just like with the character. It usually provides really good inspiration for me. And you can make up your own, pick them from any class, or just go to the tables on pages 89 through 91 of the DM's guide and pick from there. The DM's guide also has plenty of tables for useful knowledge, occupation, talent, how they interact with other individuals, and more. But this video is about NPC stats, so let's move on to NPCs that might need a little bit more stats. So far, I've been talking about NPCs that aren't very important or prevalent, but what about NPCs that come up more often and will need to make a little bit more checks? What about NPCs that will fight? Well, with these, I usually make full-on stats like I would for normal characters simply because they'll be making much more checks, and it's much more difficult to predict what stats they're likely to use. Now, for people like merchants that may come up a little bit more than usual, if you have a merchant that is especially close to players, for example, you might be able to get away with giving them just a charisma and a wisdom score and then some proficiencies in persuasion and insight, since that's what they'll be doing most often. That is, unless you give them a backstory where they're, for example, once a soldier or something and you think that'll come up, then sure, give them full-on character stats if you want. But for really important NPCs, I'm talking story-driven followers, big figures who push the story forward like villains, party patrons, and anyone who they'll be fighting, I think it's easier just to make a full-on character. However, before you start yelling at your screen about how that's a lot of work, you're right, and there are a few exceptions. The easiest ones to work with are just the run-of-the-mill bandits or thieves or little NPCs like monsters that your opponents will be fighting. You could make one generic rogue or fighter or whatever and use small variations on this for different enemy NPCs, but you're probably better off going to the appendix of the monster manual where you'll find full-on stat blocks for different kinds of NPCs, just like you'd find stat blocks for monsters in the rest of the monster manual. And then you can change and modify them just like you would a normal monster stat block, changing their HP, AC, attacks, ability scores, modifiers, and even their spells and actions and traits if you want to, as you see fit. You can even just use a monster stat block for NPC if it only exists in combat. Just take a monster that you feel is similar enough or make your own. It's kind of like making a character, but skipping all the unnecessary leveling stuff. But this episode isn't about building stat blocks or modifying monsters. For more on that, I recommend you to check out my videos on combat. I mentioned a little bit more in those. Plus, that's definitely a topic that deserves its own episode. And if you have an NPC, a single NPC, who will be fighting all of the players, you need to do a little bit more than just make an NPC that has the same level as the characters. For example, if this is a boss or something. Remember, there will be 4 other people of the same level fighting something of the same level. This NPC will need a CR of their level. CR, or a combat rating if you don't know, is a number equal to the level that a party of 4 would need to be to defeat this NPC with a moderate level of difficulty. It's not exact science, as not all monsters have the same abilities. There are some that are built to absorb attacks with a lot of HP, others have lower HP to shut more attacks, and this doesn't even account for player creativity. So use your best judgment when considering CR. For these, it helps to either think of them like a monster with a stat block, or build them like a character, or give them extra additions, like the ability to grapple as a bonus action, an extra feat or 2, additional spell slots, and I might even round their modifiers up or give them equipment that will improve their HP and AC. And on top of that, all the characterization stuff that I mentioned before in my first point, like personality, ideal, bonded, flaw, is also stuff you might want to do as well, because chances are these NPCs are going to be possibly bosses that'll appear more than just once. But that's it for this week's episode. Thanks for watching, and I hope it was helpful. Feel free to check out this week's story where I go back to Brunun and talk a little bit more about a character arc that I've had her go through. Also, feel free to come back next week where I'll talk about how I characterize NPCs and give them personality, and come back to Vincent, a character that I played a little while back, and talk a little bit more about him. And of course, until next time, let's learn something.